there's no point creating assets and ideas for channels or for stuff that performs well on certain channels if the company isn't particularly interested or doesn't have its audience there.
You're listening to the Content 10x podcast, where it's all about content repurposing. I'm Amy Woods, and I'm here to help you maximise your content and find smart ways to get your message in front of more of the right people, whilst also saving time. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Content 10x podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and in this episode, I'm joined by a fantastic guest, and we talk all about repurposing B2B marketing reports. Now, my guest is Daniel Plume. Daniel is a content marketing strategist with over 15 years of experience in marketing for brands like Dropbox, Oracle, and ServiceNow. Daniel really caught my attention with an excellent LinkedIn post that he wrote, where he was talking about how he was editing and repurposing a mammoth report for a client, and he discussed a 7-step process that he follows. I really wanted to find out more, and I was delighted when Daniel agreed to come onto the podcast to share this. So listen in to hear Daniel's detailed breakdown of his 7-step process for editing a 55-page report and how he is repurposing it for all stages of the marketing funnel. It's a fantastic conversation. Let's dive in. Daniel, a very, very warm welcome to the Content 10x podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As soon as I saw that fantastic post that you put on LinkedIn, which I'll talk about in a minute, I thought I need to get Daniel on the show, and I'm so pleased that you said yes, so it's going to be good. Now, we're going to be talking about repurposing reports, aren't we? But before we dig into that, could you just in summary share a bit more about, the journey that got you to where you are today?
Sure. So I'm currently sort of running my own content studio and strategy house or agency, I guess. I spent 15 years working in and around content, a kind of accidental marketer and accidental content creator. I wanted to be a journalist, realized there was no money in journalism, and I was regurgitating press releases for companies that didn't really seem to have a clue about how comms worked. So I made the switch and I went to work for businesses and an agency. So I've worked my way up from kind of content creator to content and team lead. My most recent job before being made redundant was for a product consultancy where I built a team and an internal kind of brand agency overseeing digital design, content, copy and strategy. And then, as I said, I got made redundant at the end of last year and went out solo. So I'm now sort of helping clients with their content, be more intentional around it and create content that resonates with their particular audiences. Because I think everyone's doing content, but sometimes that really fundamental strategy piece gets left behind.
As I mentioned, this podcast, Content 10x podcast, we always look at ways that we can maximize and repurpose and squeeze value from content. And I loved a LinkedIn post that you put out recently where you were saying that you had a 55-page report that you were working on.
At least,
yeah. At least, yeah. And there was a 6-step process that you had to extract the maximum value from it. I love the 6 steps, and I want to go through them with you if that's okay. But firstly, just a bit of background to the report. So what kind of report were you looking at, like into B2B, B2C? What kind of topic was it covering?
Yeah, so it's a B2B report. There was some primary research in there, but mostly it was exploring ESG actually and investment into kind of privately owned businesses from private equity and other kind of investors, and the importance and the role of ESG policies within that. And I was brought into it cold, and it had been commissioned and written by a South African agency. Basically, it was expediency was the kind of core driver for the client. And they put this agency under pressure and they got it back. And then they realized that actually it wasn't good enough. They were going to have to stop, regroup and start again. And I was the lucky one on the receiving end of, as you said, 55 pages of stuff that needed to be picked apart, repurposed, edited, and kind of have that narrative extracted from it and turned around into something a little bit more impactful.
So really it was a case of we've got lots of good stuff in here, but we need to do something different with it and extract the value from it.
So it was pulled together, like I said, with that South African agency, and they'd done a couple of rounded edits, but they just realized that it wasn't good enough and it was overly long, and their kind of belief within the client from their own work and understanding what works for them on their channels in terms of length and readability and usability and people kind of actually engaging with this stuff. They had a proposed limit of how long something should be, and this was sort of double that. So it was a question of what's the core of the story that we want to go out with, and what's some of the stuff around the edges that we can take out, repurpose, make sharper, put into a different format. So they were approaching it with a repurpose, reskin and condensing kind of mindset, which was really good actually, because there was plenty to get stuck into.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And then, you come along and save the day. So,
well, we'll see, but hopefully.
Yeah. Let's walk through the 6 steps then. So stage 1, what do we do?
So stage 1 was reading the report through. To be honest, I really struggled with this one because I want to get the pen out and start, crossing things off intrinsically. Like, it's sort of grates for me when I read a sentence and I think I can't get past that. So I have to sort of sit on my hands and kind of go through it. But sometimes what happens is you can get sort of stuck into that kind of editing process straight away. It's like, oh, well, they should really be talking about this, or it should take this way. And then you suddenly realize that like a couple of paragraphs down the line, it does start talking about that. And then it's backtracking, go back over it. So reading it through, depending on the length of it, because this was 55 pages, I kind of took a couple of stabs at kind of really reading it through because there was a lot to kind of digest and take in. If you don't do that, actually it will take, well, certainly for me anyway, it takes twice as long to then go through and edit it properly. So that's what I try and do, is try and take it all in. And yeah, if it's not too long, I'll go away and come back again and read it again before getting stuck in.
Yeah, I'm totally with you that I find it really hard to just go through something without just at least making some comments and this, that and the other. It takes quite a bit of willpower. If you were both obviously quite similar in that regard. So step 1 is really sort of forcing yourself to just get through the whole thing without doing anything and just get through it and do a holistic review of what's in here, what's it all about. And then step 2, so what do we move on to then?
For me, after sort of reading it through, I really try and position myself with who is the target for this work, and then go through it again with key sections, takeaways, and highlighting that stuff and highlighting fluff. Essentially, with a report of that length, typically what happens from an agency perspective is more than one person will work on it. And when more than one person works on it, you'll get duplication, you'll get repetition, you'll get the same things said in multiple ways, but essentially that are the same, that can all be stripped away and taken out. So there's a lot of kind of going through, highlighting the bits and pieces that are good, trying to put a red line through stuff that can literally be taken out. So it's just about understanding what the core narrative of the piece is, which you should have been able to pick up from the whole, reading it all through. And then it's okay, well, if that's the narrative and the thread, where can I strip stuff out? Where can I enhance? Or perhaps there's even a question of, I know this is then touching on to the next step, but actually reviewing the structure in the narrative. So highlight the key sections and then moving on to the structure and the narrative. Because like I said, if there's a few people that have been working on it, when duplication and repetition does come in, suddenly that structure and the narrative can be blown out because you're jumping from bit to bit, because you're correcting and overcorrecting and explaining that you don't need to do. So that was large. I would say that was probably the biggest point of work within this particular report, was just stripping it back and maneuvering things around into a bit more of a narrative that ultimately the reader would take away.
I really like this step in terms of, as you said, just really going through and identifying the value and extracting the value and looking at the structure before you're trying to retrofit that into some repurposing idea that you have. Instead of, trawling through and thinking, right, I'll find 10 tweets and 5 LinkedIn posts. Actually, just first, where's the value? What's good? Highlight it. What would be the structure? So number 2, you're highlighting those sections. Number 3, reviewing structure and narrative. What do we do after that stage?
So you've stripped out the nonsense, or the narrative that got down to the bare kind of core of it. You haven't completely removed it from the document. So some of that stuff is there. So that next kind of phase for me, when I was doing this, it's okay, what can we take away and create a separate body of content? What can we expand upon? Because like I said, this is there was a lot of educational content in there, which might make more sense further up the funnel. So absolutely that becomes blogs, or it could become a sort of slide share, carousel, whatever that may be, but it moves further up the funnel, really identifying opportunities and follow-up ideas. So thinking holistically from top, middle and bottom of funnel. This was very much in that mid phase, in that middle section where people understand the issue. They're perhaps looking at ways to solve it or ways through it. So it's like, okay, well, if we're talking about this, that, or the other, what is the next step that we want people to take from here? And what could bring people into here? And then finding all of that unmissable stuff that provides context, that gives you an opportunity to have those more in-depth discussions with other collaborators, with other experts in the field, picking out those questions for subject matter experts, for podcast debates like this one, video opportunities, all of that juicy stuff, which rather than, that then kind of makes it actually, I guess, like a full kind of multi-channel campaign, which has got a start point, a middle point, and an end point. Typically, like as an agency side kind of content creator and strategist, often what happens is that I'm brought in to fulfill a brief where a lot of that thinking perhaps has been done, but often it hasn't been. And in this instance, I was actively encouraged to go away and find what's the next step? Like, what could we push out into another piece of content, or where could we funnel people through as a next kind of port of call, and come up with those ideas around it. And with so much in there was a whole host of stuff to kind of fill that thinking and do that full end-to-end thinking around a big body of content. The whole thinking for me around repurposing anyway, it's like to broaden the reach, but also kind of funnel down to take people all, like not just to, we just needed to reach as many people as possible, but also to like funnel them through to that next step. So that was what I do after that kind of step 4, is thinking that through. And maybe sometimes I didn't in this instance, but I have done, it's like drawn that out on a Miro board of like, if this is the report, this section, this section, this section, and kind of draw how users could flow through the piece. In this report, we added sidebars and call out boxes for case studies and other bits and pieces that didn't detract from the main narrative, but were also relevant at the time that people could go and read straight away too.
As you're talking through about doing that analysis, I'm just thinking to myself about the different channels that the company that you're doing the repurposing for, or just, you know, if you're doing it in-house, obviously your own channels. It's important to do that channel analysis, isn't it? Because I know you mentioned in your post, which I thought was great, that there's additional content ideas, as you just said, could be discussion points, questions with subject matter experts. Maybe you pick out some podcast debates if you have a podcast, in LinkedIn carousels, LinkedIn post videos, and so on. There's so much you can do. So I guess, you know, at this stage, when you're identifying the repurposing opportunities, are you doing that channel analysis as well of, well, what channels are available to you? What do you currently have? Where do you engage with your audience at the moment? Where do you get the most engagement?
We haven't gotten fully to that phase yet, but that is definitely the next step. So there's no point creating assets and ideas for channels or for stuff that you know performs well on certain channels if the company isn't particularly interested or doesn't have its audience there. So it's kind of step 4 and also like a final step in this instance, just because of the nature of like needing to get that main report sort of finalized before we kind of went on. But what I'd like to do with clients is, on big bodies of work, is to almost have those discussions ahead of time, to talk about repurposing and distribution ahead of time, almost like kind of distribution first, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, sometimes there can be a misdirection of effort, like where people go about a task like this, but maybe start to focus on some of the wrong channels and not focusing on the right ones. But I also find quite often that clients that we work with, or people that I speak to, will also miss really obvious available channels that we could create some content for when we're working on something like this, like repurposing an ebook or a report. Like classic things, you've got this really engaged email subscriber list, quarterly or weekly, whatever, the email that goes out to a really like hard-earned audience of subscribers, and forget to discuss actually, well, could we put some content into your next newsletter about this and things like that? You know, just some areas, like often sometimes think just about the website and social, but there's all these other, oh right, you know, you're speaking at an event in a month or so, a sort of representative of the company is there anything about this in the talk as well, in the presentation, things like that? You have to think, or you can miss, can't you, if you're not careful? So doing that analysis.
Yeah.
What is step number 5 in the process? We've just been identifying repurposing opportunities and all the follow-up ideas.
This is where I returned my attention to the writing and pulled out my red pen and started striking stuff through and reworking stuff for accuracy and being more succinct. Yeah, it was such a large report. Like there was big chunks of it that were culled early on, but in terms of readability and like really zeroing in on audience need, there was quite a big chunk of work here to kind of bring it all together. I read it out loud after that, which was much to the amusement of my partner and my young daughter, who thought I'd completely lost the plot, sort of speaking out loud, but to myself in here. But you immediately hear where sentences don't work, and you can quickly pick up the delivery pace. And I know it sounds silly because it's being read, but the sentence structure and the way that you structure a piece like has a really big influence on like if it's all long sentences, for example, people lose interest because it just goes on and on and on, or it feels like it goes on and on. So doing the edit and then reading it out loud and making sure that it makes sense and it flows from as you say it. That was probably a good week's worth of the work on this, just kind of dipping in and out, because you can't, I don't know about you, but I can't stay zero in and focus on, I kind of do it in chunks, otherwise my brain sort of starts to not see words the same way, like missing obvious typos or stuff like that. So yeah, that's how I sort of broke that up and read it out loud.
I absolutely loved the tip, by the way, on reading out loud. I often do that. And like you said, it seems funny when it's a written piece of content that the person isn't, like, it's not being read out loud. It's not a video script, but it does just make such a difference to do that. And you spot those long sentences, like you said, and things like that. So fantastic editing tip. Hey, just a little break from this podcast episode to ask you a question. Would you like one single place that you can go to that provides you with everything you need to be able to implement the best practices in content repurposing for your video content, your podcast episodes, and your social media content today? To help you get more value from the content that you create, get more time back, and help you reach more people than you ever thought possible. If so, then you are going to love the Content 10x Toolkit. The toolkit is full of video tutorials, templates, checklists, swipe files, step-by-step guides and more that shows you how to repurpose your content in the best ways possible today. No more Googling, no more figuring it out yourself. We provide you with everything that you need to become a content repurposing pro. If this sounds like something that would interest you, then go check out the Content 10x Toolkit at content10x.com/toolkit. Okay, and back to this week's episode. Let's move on to number 6. So what do you do after that intense edit stage?
I need to kind of let it breathe, because there's a compulsion, certainly on my end, of like once you get to the end, just going, right, send that, done, get it off the desk, let's move on with another task. But you need another run through before you sort of ship it. So if you've got time, sleep on it. If you haven't and you've only got kind of, you're up against a tight deadline, just go and do something else, go and make a cup of tea and just like watch the bubbles in the kettle, like anything like that to just completely like kind of reset your brain, like try and wash away some of the torment of the last sort of few days or however long it's taken you to kind of get through to the edit process, like get through that edit process. So that was a big thing for me, because then you kind of come back and you read it out loud again and you just make those kind of final edits. I can't remember who told me to do that, but I have implemented it ever since, and it makes a huge, huge difference. Certainly from my point of view of like just taking that extra time to read it again.
Big space to let it breathe and then revisit after you've given enough breathing space to be able to, review with fresh eyes. So that's great. And then what is sort of final step 7 of this process?
So in this instance, it's step 7, but it's kind of collaborating with a designer. So we're doing final copy edits back and forth between the client at the moment. And then that next step is actually working collaboratively with the designer to see how it looks on the page. I don't know, there's two schools of thoughts on this, in kind of like having a template and writing content for a template, or producing the content and then working together to kind of make that work. I've tried both methods and both are fine. Sometimes I find working from a template can sort of force you to write in a certain way. Not necessarily good or bad, but it certainly does make you think differently about the length of content that you're putting into a certain space when you know that you've only got a certain structure to work within. So there are pluses and minuses there, because you have to be ruthless with what goes in and what doesn't. Sometimes there are bits and pieces of work that need that space and time to breathe. And often working with a designer who you trust and work well with when you start putting stuff together on a page, they can immediately pull you up on like, well, this doesn't work. This is going to overflow into like, like by a paragraph onto another page, for example. And that can be, for me, working that way around, having the content and then looking at how it will fit into the template and the structure that we're working towards, not the other way around, having a template and structure, writing content is the way for me. Yeah, and it sort of forces you to view the content differently as well in terms of the white space and that kind of initial, I don't know if you get this, but there are some things that I know that I want to read and I will download them, or I'll look at them and I'll turn the page, or I'll sort of scroll down and I'm just like overwhelmed. And I'm just like, I can't even deal with that right now. And often that will mean that it will sit in my desktop, in my downloads folder or wherever for forever until maybe one day I have to look at it. So that kind of visual element of it is really important. And I don't underestimate the power of sort of sitting with the designer at that initial kind of like mocking it up stage and seeing what it looks like, rather than suddenly seeing the whole thing at the end and be like, that isn't how I envisaged it looking at all. So having that kind of design, I think probably the most important thing, because you kind of get that feeling of like, what's the reader going to feel when they look at it? And I think in a digital age where you just kind of put stuff up and you sort of write for algorithms or whatever, like actually like missing that bit of like what it looks like and what it feels like to interact with is a big miss.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. I agree, because it could be the best content, the best written piece ever. But if it's, as you said, if it's intimidating to look at and it's just not something that's going to get people to actually read, then what a waste that is.
Exactly.
We often find that we all did numerous reviews of something and it all looked absolutely great in Word or Google Doc or whatever. But as you said, when it got to the designer and then the designer's like, ta-da, here it is. And we're just like, oh no, like, it looks it looks completely right.
It's like, oh no, because it sort of feels like you're right back to square one. You kind of want that momentum to kind of take it through into all the distribution as well, because then you're sort of excited for getting it out there. It looks good, it reads well, or it watches well, or whatever. So it's kind of like it's just the most crucial step, I think, for a lot of these, especially a big report.
Exactly. And sometimes when we're sort of painting over like words and sections and things like that, we'll just get to the point of saying, we know it's not completely right, but let's just get it designed now. And then we'll know how to fiddle with this once we've seen it in the design stage. Like we kind of know we're going to have to fiddle with it a bit. So yeah, it's so important. Don't step away from the collaboration with the designer and work with the designer, because you have to be confident, like you said, that it's going to be appealing on the eye and that people will actually consume that content. I know it's still work in progress, as you've mentioned at the moment. It's a huge piece that you've been working on. Like, what kind of content are you looking to have produced from it? What's the sort of different distributed pieces of content in a nutshell?
So what we've sort of extracted from it, so I had my initial list of ideas, concepts, and where I thought we needed to kind of ramp up and look at kind of that next step at the conversion element of it, of how we can convert readers into customers. So there's obviously the one hero report, which, like I say, we're just finalizing now, and then I think is going to be translated across, I think it's at least 18 different languages. So then there's sector-specific breakdowns and breakout reports within that. There could be, at the moment, I've kind of identified 3 that are kind of spoken about at length in the report, but the client may decide that actually there's enough there to ramp up and expand that across more of the verticals that they work within. There's video ideas and concepts within that I've kind of mapped out as a very loose storyboard about what they could do with that. There's trends, there's some statistical insights, and then there's a couple of other sort of loose case studies that are within that, which I've mapped as potential long-form blog articles. I think I've written in the post that there's 12, but I think there might be more now as we've gone through a few more edits and called out a couple of extra bits. And there's a whole host of questions that we've pulled together to speak to ESG experts, to private equity firms, to other kind of investors that can add more color and context onto some of those more pertinent points. Obviously, the back of that is either interview Q&As, it could be podcasts, it could be videos, it could be talking heads, it could be events, it could be keynote presentations, it could be whatever, right? There's a whole host of things that, particularly with the ESG, because it's such a hot topic. And there's potentially hundreds of kind of different social posts and stat cards and points of view and all manner of things for a host of different channels. And it kind of feels like I've just realized I signed off and we're just getting started. Doesn't feel like that. But I kind of mean it in the sense that like you alluded to, like these things are kind of evergreen. I mean, research reports tend to last until the next piece. And then you have your benchmarking and your comparison stuff to do anyway. So you've got the whole world of stories and narratives to extract from that as well. This is the first time they've done a report of this nature. It's a bit of a new, not a new field, but something that they're really ramping up their efforts into. So it kind of feels like this is the kind of keystone piece for at least the next sort of 6 to 12 months before they're kind of planning the next report and perhaps doing a more in-depth research piece, an in-depth study, taking their learnings from the subject matter experts that they're going to speak to, partners in the field, all of that comes with it. So there's a world of stuff that is in the offing to be created and sort of outlines already mapped for blog articles and video storyboards and stuff. Typically with reports of this size, there is so much that it's a huge topic. So there's so much that is unsaid for one reason or another in favor of like that core message, but is actually adds color and adds narrative to what the client is really trying to say about their position within, in this case, sort of like the ESG marketplace and world.
It's amazing how much content and content opportunities that not just the different types of content, but then obviously when you mentioned about additional interviews and discussions with SMEs and things like that, well, in the formats that they have, it's just the gift that keeps on giving, because that will be other forms of content that can be repurposed in a similar way. I love this story. I mean, the process that you've gone through is like super interesting for anyone faced with this task of repurposing a fairly substantial report. I actually realised that I introduced this as a 6-step process, yet we did 7 steps. So we've got a bonus step in there, the secret, sneaky bonus step in number 7.
And no one will know about it unless they listen to the end.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've noticed, then that's amazing.
You'll make this, but then that's the hook for the distribution right there.
Yeah, exactly. I love the way that you explained that there was issues with the report. It wasn't quite what they wanted, and repurposing in the form of the expertise of Daniel as well saved the day, didn't it? Because it was just, well, there's so much from this, so let's extract the value, let's get more from it. So it's I know you said the report is still going ahead and improved and will still be going ahead, but the fact that so much came from something that was perhaps a little bit underwhelming when they first received it is amazing.
Thank you.
So, final question. Someone is faced with this task, similar 5,500-page report, and we've just gone through loads of tips, but what if there's one big mistake or mishap that you would like to suggest, please like try and avoid this, what would it be?
Everyone's got their own way of approaching editing and reading things through, but for me, like reading aloud, as I mentioned, was game changing for me. Once I started doing that, I started immediately seeing where the flaws were in my writing, and it then has a knock-on impact to my content production for other clients down the road as well. It's just having that kind of realization that things are too long, need to sort of break that up, add some rhythm, add some character, add some soul. So that's kind of like my number one. And if you can, like my first, like don't do anything until you've read it, and like inhabit the reader's shoes properly. Like do a bit of reading about the target that it's for and understand their pain points and challenges first, because I'm not an expert in ESG, but just a little bit of reading around the subject, reading the report, taking time, reading it again was instrumental in saving me a lot of time down the road. And I know that it's daunting when someone slaps a 55-page report in front of you, but just take the time, put some headphones on. Orange noise or white noise is really good. I don't know if allowed to add a third idea or concept in there. For me, that has also been a bit of a game changer in terms of just like helping me focus and stay on point and not listen to music as I normally do, or sit in silence, which I can't bear.
I agree. It's really funny. During the lockdowns, I used to listen to this white noise app, which was the background sound of a coffee shop. I can't remember what it was called, but it was an app and you chose different sounds, like being in a meadow, being here and there. And because of not being in coffee shops since forever, I used to sit at work and just have the sound of like bangs and people and coffee shop and stuff like that. Somehow made me more in the zone, because I do sometimes struggle with silence, but music distracts me. Obviously, a podcast would be extremely distracting, so it needs to be white noise.
Anything with words.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything with words. The amount of times I find myself typing lyrics, I'm like, no, right.
Click a few lyrics in there.
Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing. Thank you for those final tips. They're just incredibly useful. And I know, listeners will have really enjoyed just hearing some great tips on what you do when you face a task like that and the kind of results that you can get as well. So thank you for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure.
Where would you like, well, I think you're going to say LinkedIn, but I'll ask the question anyway. Where would you like people to go and connect with you and let you know how much they enjoyed this?
Yeah, definitely find me on LinkedIn, Daniel Plume. Come and join me and connect with me on there. I try and post other useful insights and tips around content, repurposing, strategy, hopefully daily, but sometimes life with 2 kids gets in the way. Yeah, come and find me on there. Always happy to talk and hear about other success stories and content wins and anything else you want to share, really. My DMs are always open, so I look forward to speaking with you on there.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'll put the link to how to connect with Daniel, obviously, in the show notes, so do check that out. Highly recommend. I love your posts. There's a lot of nonsense and regurgitation and things like that on LinkedIn, and I always think that you put some real sort of thought into sharing just some great insights and things like that.
I do try.
You do. And it shows, honestly. You see all the kind of nonsense and this and that is on LinkedIn, and then you see the really good posts, and you're in that category of the really good posts. So connect and follow Daniel and say hi. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll wrap up there. So thank you for coming on the show, Daniel. It's been awesome. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that discussion, and thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoy the Content 10x podcast, then why not hit that subscribe button on your podcast listening app of choice so that you can get updated when new episodes are released. And I'd really, really appreciate it if you could leave a review as well. That really makes a difference for the podcast. Also, please do get a copy of my book, Content 10x, More Content, Less Time, Maximum Results. It is the ultimate guide to repurposing every type of content, and it's available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback, and also in audiobook as well. And you can head to content10x.com/book to find all the other places that you can get a copy of my book. And if you would like us to do your content repurposing for you, then we offer a fully end-to-end done for you content repurposing service. This is for podcasters and video content creators. We have our podcast 10x, video 10x, and also our specific LinkedIn 10x service, helping you to become the leading authority in your industry on LinkedIn. You can find out so much more about our services on our website. And also, please do give me a follow on the social media platforms. I share lots and lots of tips and advice on social media about content repurposing. I'm at Content 10x on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and if you try content10x.com/LinkedIn, you'll find my LinkedIn profile over there as well. All that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.